The grand ballroom sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. Rich people in expensive suits and glittering dresses filled every corner of the room. This was the kind of place where a single dinner plate cost more than what most people earned in a week. Tonight was special. The city's most famous music school was throwing their biggest fundraising party of the year. Everyone had come to see one person. Antonio Delacroix sat at the beautiful black piano in the center of the room. His fingers danced across the keys like magic. Every note was perfect. Every melody made people close their eyes and smile. He was the kind of pianist that only came along once in a lifetime. Newspapers called him a genius. Concert halls around the world begged him to perform. But Antonio had a problem. Success had made him cold. He looked down on people who weren't as talented as him. He forgot what it felt like to struggle. To him, music wasn't about touching hearts anymore. It was about showing off how much better he was than everyone else. The crowd gathered around him as he finished playing a difficult piece. They clapped loudly and praised his skill. Antonio stood up and adjusted his perfect bow tie. He loved being the center of attention. He loved the way people hung on his every word. "You know," he said with a sly smile, "real musical talent is so rare these days. Most people think they can play, but they have no idea what real music sounds like." The wealthy guests nodded and agreed. They sipped their expensive wine and felt superior. After all, they were here with a famous musician. They must understand music better than ordinary people. At that exact moment, something unexpected happened. A young boy walked into the room carrying a bucket and mop. He wore old clothes that had been washed too many times. His shoes had holes in them. His hair was messy from working all evening. The boy's name was David, and he was 12 years old. His mother worked in the kitchen of this fancy building. His father cleaned the floors and fixed broken things. While other kids his age played video games or watched TV, David spent his evenings helping his parents work. David tried to walk quietly along the wall. He needed to clean up some spilled drinks near the piano area. He didn't want to bother the important people. He knew he didn't belong in a room like this, but as he got closer to the piano, something went wrong. His foot caught on the fancy carpet. The bucket slipped from his hands. Water splashed everywhere. Worse yet, he bumped into a small table covered with sheet music. Papers flew through the air like white birds. They scattered all over the shiny floor. The sound of splashing water and falling papers made everyone turn around. Conversation stopped. People stared. David's face turned bright red. He quickly got on his hands and knees, trying to pick up the wet papers. His hands shook as he tried to clean up the mess. He whispered sorry over and over again, but his voice was so quiet that nobody could hear him. Antonio watched this scene with growing annoyance. How dare this boy interrupt his perfect evening? How dare he make a mess in front of all these important people? An idea formed in his mind. A cruel idea that would put this boy in his place and give the crowd something to laugh about. "Well, well," Antonio said loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "What do we have here?" All eyes turned to the famous pianist. David looked up from the floor, still holding wet papers in his hands. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to run away and hide. Antonio walked over slowly like a cat approaching a mouse. His expensive shoes clicked on the marble floor. The crowd followed behind him, curious to see what would happen next. "Young man," Antonio said with fake kindness in his voice, "I see you've made quite a mess of our music." David stood up slowly. He was much shorter than the tall pianist. His wet clothes dripped on the expensive carpet. "I'm really sorry, sir. I'll clean it all up right now." "Oh, don't worry about that," Antonio said with a wave of his hand. "But tell me, do you know what these papers are?" David looked down at the sheet music in his hands. Even though it was wet, he could see the black notes dancing across the lines. "It's music, sir." "That's right," Antonio exclaimed, turning to address the crowd. "This is music written by some of the greatest composers who ever lived. Bach, Chopin, Beethoven. Masters who spent their entire lives perfecting their art." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some people started to smile, sensing that something entertaining was about to happen. Antonio put his hand on David's shoulder in a way that looked friendly, but felt heavy and uncomfortable. "Now, since you've disturbed our musical evening, I think it's only fair that you should contribute something to make up for it." David's heart started beating faster. He didn't like where this was going. "I have an idea," Antonio continued, his voice getting louder and more theatrical. "Why don't you show all these wonderful people what real music sounds like?" After all, you've been handling these masterpieces. Surely some of their genius has rubbed off on you. Someone in the crowd laughed. Then another person joined in. Soon several people were chuckling at the absurd suggestion. A boy in work clothes playing piano in front of the city's most important people? It was ridiculous. Antonio gestured grandly toward the magnificent piano. Go ahead, young man. Don't be shy. Show us what you can do. David looked at the piano. It was the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen up close. The black surface was so shiny he could see his reflection in it. The keys looked like perfect white teeth in a giant smile, but he also looked at all the people watching him. Men in expensive suits, women wearing jewelry worth more than his family's car. They were all waiting for him to embarrass himself. They wanted to laugh at the poor boy who didn't know his place. I can't, sir, David whispered. I don't know how to play. Nonsense, Antonio declared. Anyone can bang on keys and make noise. That's what most people call music these days anyway. The crowd laughed harder now. They were enjoying this cruel entertainment. It made them feel better about themselves to watch someone else struggle. Antonio leaned down and spoke quietly in David's ear, but loud enough for others to hear. Come on, boy. You've already ruined our evening. The least you can do is give us a good laugh. David felt tears starting to form in his eyes. He wanted to run away. He wanted his parents to come and rescue him, but he knew they were busy working. They needed this job. If he caused trouble, his whole family might suffer. The room fell silent except for the quiet tick of an expensive clock on the wall. Everyone was waiting. Some people had pulled out their phones ready to record whatever happened next. They expected to see a boy make a fool of himself. They expected to have a funny story to tell their friends tomorrow. What they didn't expect was what was about to happen next. David took a deep breath and looked at the piano one more time. His hand stopped shaking. Something changed in his eyes. Without saying another word, he started walking toward the instrument that would change his life forever. David's footsteps echoed in the silent room as he walked toward the piano. Each step felt like it took forever. The beautiful instrument seemed to grow bigger and more intimidating as he got closer. Behind him, he could hear people whispering and moving around to get a better view. Someone near the back of the crowd whispered, "This is going to be hilarious." Another person said, "Poor kid doesn't know what he's getting himself into." But David couldn't hear their words clearly. His heart was pounding so loud in his ears that it drowned out almost everything else. All he could think about were the countless nights he had dreamed of this moment. Not like this, of course, not with people expecting him to fail. But still, here he was, standing in front of a real concert piano. Antonio followed behind him with a smug smile on his face. He was already imagining how funny this would be. He pictured the boy hitting random keys and making terrible sounds. Everyone would laugh, and then they could get back to the real music. The important music. His music. Don't be nervous, Antonio said loudly, making sure everyone could hear his fake kindness. Just do your best. We're all friends here. David reached the piano bench and stopped. The seat was exactly the right height. The keys were clean and perfect, without a single scratch or mark. This piano was worth more money than his family would see in 10 years. He had only seen instruments like this in pictures and through windows. He sat down slowly and placed his hands in his lap. They were rough and calloused from helping his parents with their work. His fingernails were clean, but they were cut short and practical. These weren't the soft, pampered hands of someone who had taken piano lessons since childhood. The crowd pressed closer. Phone cameras started recording. Someone in the back stood on a chair to see better. They were all waiting for the show to begin. The show where a poor boy would embarrass himself in front of his betters. But something strange was happening to David. As soon as he sat on that bench, as soon as his hands hovered over those keys, he felt different. All the fear and embarrassment started to fade away. This was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life, even though nobody knew it. You see, David had a secret that even his parents didn't fully understand. For the past 4 years, while they worked late into the night cleaning this building, David had been learning. Not from fancy teachers or expensive lessons. He learned by watching and listening and practicing whenever he could. Late at night, when the music school was empty and quiet, David would sneak into the practice rooms. He would sit at old out-of-tune pianos and teach himself to play. He learned by watching YouTube videos on his mother's cracked phone screen. He learned by reading library books about music theory. Most importantly, he learned by listening to his heart. While other kids played video games, David practiced scales. While they watched TV, he worked on Bach exercises. While they slept, he sat in empty classrooms and tried to understand how the great composers created such beautiful sounds. Now, sitting at this magnificent piano, all those hours of secret practice came rushing back to him. His hands remembered what to do. His ears remembered what real music should sound like. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, something had changed. The nervous boy was gone. In his place sat a musician. His right hand moved first, just one finger pressing down on a single key. The note rang out clear and pure in the silent room. It was a simple C, but somehow it sounded different when David played it. It sounded like it meant something. Then his left hand joined in. Another note, lower and deeper. The two sounds blended together perfectly. Some people in the crowd stopped smiling. This wasn't what they expected. David's hands began to move more confidently. He started playing a melody that everyone recognized but couldn't quite name. It was simple at first, like a lullaby that a mother might sing to her child. But as he played, the music began to grow and change. Antonio's smile started to fade. This wasn't random key banging. This was actual music, real music. The boy was playing actual notes that made sense together. The melody continued to develop. David's left hand added a bass line that supported the tune perfectly. His right hand began to add small decorations and flourishes. Nothing fancy or showing off, just pure, honest music. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Wait, is he actually playing something?" Another person said, "Those aren't random notes. He knows what he's doing." But David didn't hear them. He was lost in his own world now, the world where music lived. His hands moved across the keys like they had been doing this for years, because in a way they had been. The simple melody began to transform into something more complex. David started to play variations on the theme. His left hand created a walking bass line while his right hand danced above it. The music filled the room like warm sunlight. People stopped talking. Phones that had been held up to record a funny disaster were now capturing something completely unexpected. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was a performance. Antonio felt his face growing hot. This wasn't supposed to happen. The boy was supposed to fail. He was supposed to prove that real music belonged to real musicians. People like Antonio, not people like this 12-year-old in old clothes. But David kept playing and the music kept getting better. He moved from the simple tune into something that sounded like it could be in a concert hall. His technique wasn't perfect. A trained musician could hear small mistakes and rough spots. But his musicality was undeniable. The melody shifted into a minor key, and suddenly the room felt different. The music became sadder, more emotional. It told a story about struggle and hard work, about dreams that seemed impossible, about hope that refused to die even when everything was difficult. Some people in the crowd felt tears in their eyes, though they couldn't explain why. The music was reaching into their hearts and touching something they had forgotten was there. David's hands moved faster now, but not in a frantic way. Every note had a purpose. Every phrase meant something. He played like someone who had lived through difficult times but hadn't let them make him bitter. He played like someone who understood that music wasn't about showing off. It was about sharing something beautiful with the world. The boy who had been mopping floors 20 minutes ago was now commanding the attention of some of the most important people in the city. And he was doing it without saying a single word. He was doing it with pure, honest music that came straight from his soul. Antonio stood frozen behind the piano bench. His cruel joke had backfired completely. Instead of humiliating the boy, he had given him a stage to show his incredible talent. Instead of proving his own superiority, he had revealed his own cruelty. But David wasn't thinking about Antonio or the crowd or anything except the music. His hands found chords that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. He created harmonies that textbooks said were wrong but sounded perfectly right. As the music continued to flow from the piano, one thing became clear to everyone in that room. They weren't watching a boy pretend to play piano. They were witnessing the birth of something extraordinary, something that would change everything. The music room had transformed into something magical. What started as cruel entertainment had become something nobody expected. David's fingers continued to dance across the keys, and with each passing moment, his playing grew more confident and more beautiful. The melody he was creating seemed to tell the story of his entire life. It spoke of early mornings when his mother left for work before sunrise. It whispered about late nights when his father came home exhausted from fixing broken things. It sang about a boy who found hope in the darkest corners of empty hallrooms. Mrs. Wellington, the wife of the city's most powerful banker, stood near the front of the crowd. She had come to this party expecting small talk and expensive wine. Instead, she found herself wiping tears from her eyes. The music was reaching places in her heart that had been closed for years. "My God," she whispered to her husband. "Where did this boy learn to play like this?" Her husband, a man who usually only cared about numbers and profits, couldn't answer. He was too busy listening. The music was making him remember things he had forgotten, like the piano lessons his own mother had given him when he was young, like the dreams he had given up when he decided that making money was more important than making music. David's hands moved into a new section of his improvised piece. The music became lighter, more hopeful. It painted pictures of sunlight streaming through windows, of birds singing in the morning, of a boy discovering that his hands could create something beautiful in a world that often felt ugly. In the back of the room, David's mother heard the music and stopped loading dirty dishes into her cart. She recognized those sounds. They were the same melodies her son hummed while he helped her with chores. The same tunes he tapped out on kitchen tables when he thought nobody was listening. She had always known David loved music, but she had no idea he could actually play. How could she? They could never afford piano lessons or even a cheap keyboard. She thought his interest in music was just a childhood phase that would pass. Now, hearing him play in front of all these important people, she felt her heart breaking and mending at the same time. Breaking because she realized how much talent her son had been hiding. Mending because she was so proud of him that she could barely breathe. David's father was in the basement fixing a broken water heater when he heard the music drifting down through the vents. At first, he thought someone had turned on a radio, but as he listened more carefully, he realized the music was live. Someone was actually playing piano upstairs. Something about the melody made him stop working. He set down his wrench and just listened. The music sounded familiar somehow, like a voice he had heard before but couldn't quite place. Then it hit him. This sounded like the tunes David was always humming, but that was impossible. David didn't know how to play piano. They had never been able to give him lessons. Unless David's father remembered all those nights when David stayed behind while they worked. He had always assumed his son was just doing homework or reading. But what if he had been doing something else? What if he had been teaching himself to play? Back in the ballroom, Antonio was experiencing something he had never felt before. Shame. Deep, burning shame that made his expensive suit feel tight and uncomfortable. He had spent years believing that musical talent belonged only to people like him, people who had studied at the best schools and learned from the greatest teachers. But here was a 12-year-old boy in worn-out clothes, playing music that was more honest and beautiful than anything Antonio had performed in months. The boy hadn't studied at fancy conservatories. He probably couldn't even read music properly. But he understood something that Antonio had forgotten. He understood that music wasn't about impressing people. It wasn't about showing how technically perfect you could be. Music was about touching hearts. It was about sharing emotions that were too big for words. It was about connecting with other human beings in the deepest possible way. As David continued playing, his music began to tell new stories. Stories about struggle and determination, about nights when he practiced on silent keyboards, moving his fingers in the air because he couldn't make any sound, about watching piano lessons through classroom windows and memorizing every movement the teacher made. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the people who had been whispering had stopped talking. Some of them were crying openly. Others stood with their mouths hanging open in amazement. All of them were experiencing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. David played a passage that sounded like rain falling on a roof. Then the rain turned into sunlight and the sunlight turned into laughter. His music painted pictures that were more vivid than any photograph. It told stories that were more exciting than any movie. A famous music critic who had been standing near the back of the room pulled out his notebook and started writing frantically. He had reviewed thousands of concerts in his career. He had heard the world's greatest pianists perform in the most prestigious halls. But he had never heard anything quite like this. This wasn't just technical skill. This wasn't just someone who had memorized pieces by famous composers. This was pure musical instinct. This was a natural gift that couldn't be taught in any school or bought with any amount of money. The music began to build toward something bigger. David's left hand created a foundation that seemed to shake the very walls of the room. His right hand soared above it like a bird learning to fly. The combination was powerful enough to make people forget where they were. Some of the wealthy guests started to feel uncomfortable, but not because the music was bad. They felt uncomfortable because it was so good. It was making them question things they had believed their whole lives, like the idea that poor people couldn't create beautiful art, like the belief that talent only came to those who could afford to buy it. David's music was proving them wrong with every note. He was showing them that genius could grow anywhere, that creativity could bloom in the most unlikely places, that the most beautiful flowers sometimes grew in the cracks of broken sidewalks. The melody reached a climax that made everyone in the room hold their breath. David's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had been playing professionally for decades, but his heart played with the innocence of a child who still believed in magic. As the music began to wind down toward what seemed like an ending, people started to realize what they had just witnessed. They had seen something that might never happen again. They had been present at the moment when a hidden star was born. Antonio felt tears on his cheeks and was surprised to discover them there. When was the last time music had made him cry? When was the last time he had played something that came from his heart instead of his ego? David's playing grew softer now, more gentle. The music was telling them that even the most beautiful moments had to end, but it was also promising that beauty could be found again, in new places and new ways. As the last few notes hung in the air like golden butterflies, everyone in the room knew that their lives had been changed. They had expected to see a boy fail. Instead, they had watched a miracle unfold before their eyes. But the most incredible part of the evening was still to come. The last note faded into silence, but the magic in the room remained. David's hands slowly lifted from the keys and settled in his lap. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence was so complete that you could hear the old building settling around them. Then something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Wellington, the banker's wife who never showed emotion in public, started clapping. Not the polite, careful clapping that rich people do at boring events. Real clapping. The kind that comes from the heart. One by one, others joined her. The applause grew louder and stronger until it filled every corner of the ballroom. People who had come expecting to laugh at a poor boy were now giving him a standing ovation. But David didn't seem to notice the applause. He sat at the piano bench with his eyes closed, still lost in the world his music had created. Playing that piece had taken everything out of him, all his secret dreams, all his hidden hopes, all the music he had been carrying in his heart for years. Antonio stood frozen behind the piano. His face had gone pale. His hands were shaking. Everything he thought he knew about music, about talent, about who deserved to play beautiful instruments, had just been turned upside down. The applause finally began to fade, and David opened his eyes. He looked around the room and seemed surprised to see all these people looking at him. For a moment he had forgotten where he was. The music had transported him to a place where none of this mattered, where he wasn't a janitor's son in old clothes, where he was just a musician sharing his gift with the world. Antonio cleared his throat. Everyone turned to look at him, waiting to see what the famous pianist would say. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How do you apologize for being so wrong about someone? How do you take back cruelty that was meant to humiliate? Finally, he found his voice. He started, then stopped. He looked down at David, who was still sitting quietly at the piano. I owe you an apology, young man. A deep, sincere apology. The room was silent again. People leaned forward to hear better. I brought you to this piano to embarrass you. Antonio continued, his voice getting stronger. I thought I was better than you because of my education, my training, my fancy concerts. I was wrong. Completely wrong. Antonio walked around to face David directly. What you just played. That was real music. That was music from the soul. I haven't played anything that honest in years. David looked up at the famous pianist. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He just looked curious, like he was trying to understand why this man who had been so mean to him was now being kind. How long have you been playing? Antonio asked gently. David's voice was quiet when he answered. About 4 years, I think. Maybe longer. I taught myself by watching through the classroom windows while my parents cleaned. A murmur went through the crowd. 4 years of secret practice, learning by watching and listening. No expensive lessons, no fancy teachers, just pure determination and love for music. Mrs. Wellington stepped forward from the crowd. "Young man, what's your name?" "David, ma'am." "Well, David, that was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. Where do you go to school?" David named a public school across town. The kind of school where music programs had been cut due to budget problems. Where kids were lucky to have working computers, let alone piano lessons. "And your parents work here?" she asked. David nodded. "My mom helps in the kitchen. My dad fixes things when they break." Mrs. Wellington felt her heart breaking. This incredibly talented child had been right under their noses all this time, and nobody had noticed. His parents worked in this building full of music teachers and wealthy donors, but no one had discovered what he could do. She turned to her husband. "Richard, we need to do something about this." Richard Wellington was already pulling out his checkbook. "David, how would you like to take real piano lessons?" "With a real teacher?" David's eyes went wide. We can't afford that, sir." "You don't need to afford it," Richard said. "Consider it a scholarship." "A gift." Other voices began to speak up from the crowd. "I'll pay for sheet music and books," and called out a woman in a blue dress. "My company can sponsor a piano for his family," said a man near the back. "I know someone at the Children's Music Academy. They need to hear this boy play," added another. David looked overwhelmed. All these strangers were offering to help him, and he couldn't understand why. He had just played a song. That's all. He didn't know that he had just given them something priceless. Antonio knelt down so he could look David in the eye. "David, I want to ask you something important. Would you let me teach you? Not because I'm better than you, but because I think we could learn from each other." David stared at him in amazement. "You want to teach me?" "I want to help you become the musician you're meant to be," Antonio said. "You have a gift that's rarer than diamonds, but with proper training you could share that gift with the whole world." Just then David's parents burst through the kitchen doors. His mother still had flour on her apron. His father had grease on his hands from fixing the water heater. They had heard the music and the applause and had run upstairs to see what was happening. When they saw David sitting at the grand piano, surrounded by all these well-dressed people who were smiling and clapping, they stopped in their tracks. "David," his mother called out uncertainly. "What's going on?" David jumped up from the piano bench and ran to his parents. "Mom, Dad, I played piano for everyone." "And they liked it?" His mother looked confused. "You played piano? But honey, you don't know how to play piano." The crowd chuckled softly. It was clear that David's parents had no idea about their son's secret musical life. Antonio stepped forward and introduced himself to David's parents. "Your son has just given us the most incredible performance any of us have ever heard. He's extraordinarily talented." David's father looked skeptical. "But he's never had lessons. We couldn't afford—" "He taught himself," Antonio explained, "by watching classes through windows, by practicing late at night when the building was empty. Your son has more natural musical ability than students who have studied for decades." David's mother began to cry, not sad tears but happy ones mixed with guilt. "All those times I heard you humming," she said to David. "All those times I found you tapping on tables. I should have known. I should have found a way to get you lessons." "Mom, it's okay," David said, hugging her tight. "I got to practice here when nobody was around. This building taught me everything I needed to know." Mrs. Wellington stepped forward again. "Well, now we're going to make sure David gets the education he deserves. All of us together." The crowd nodded in agreement. Something magical had happened in this room tonight. They had all been part of discovering a star, and they wanted to be part of helping that star shine as bright as it could. But even as the adults made their plans and promises, David was looking back at the piano. Because he knew something they didn't know yet. This was just the beginning of his story. The music inside him was bigger than any of them could imagine. 5 years had passed since that magical night at the music school fundraiser. The video of David's surprise performance had spread across the internet like wildfire. Millions of people around the world had watched the 12-year-old boy in worn clothes sit down at a fancy piano and create something beautiful from nothing. But David's life had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. The promises made that night had been kept. Mrs. Wellington and her husband had indeed provided a scholarship for David's music education. Antonio had become not just his teacher, but something like an older brother. The man who had once been cruel and arrogant had been transformed by David's music into someone humble and kind. Other wealthy donors had contributed too. David's family had moved into a small but comfortable apartment. His parents no longer had to work 3 jobs just to pay for basic needs. Most importantly, David had his own piano. Not a fancy concert grand, but a good solid upright piano that filled their living room with music every day. The road hadn't been easy. Learning proper technique after years of teaching himself meant breaking some bad habits. David had to work twice as hard as other students to catch up on music theory and sight reading. There were days when his hands hurt from practicing, days when he felt overwhelmed by all the things he needed to learn, but he never gave up. And slowly, steadily, he grew from a naturally gifted boy into a truly skilled musician. Now, at 17, David stood backstage at the city's most prestigious concert hall, the same venue where the world's greatest pianists performed, where tickets cost hundreds of dollars and people dressed in their finest clothes to attend. Tonight was David's debut recital, the culmination of 5 years of intense study and practice. His hands, no longer rough from cleaning work, were steady and confident. His old worn clothes had been replaced by a simple but elegant black suit. But some things about David hadn't changed. He still hummed quietly to himself when he was nervous. He still thought about music in terms of stories and emotions rather than just notes and rhythms. And he still remembered what it felt like to be the boy that nobody believed in. In the audience, his parents sat in the front row. His mother wore a dress she had bought just for this occasion. His father had gotten a haircut and polished his old shoes until they shined. They held hands tightly, both nervous and proud beyond words. Antonio sat nearby, looking like a different person than the arrogant pianist from 5 years ago. Teaching David had taught him things about music that he had forgotten. It had reminded him why he started playing piano in the first place. Not for fame or praise, but for the pure joy of creating something beautiful. Mrs. Wellington and her husband were there too, along with many of the other wealthy donors who had supported David's education. But the audience was different from that night 5 years ago. Tonight, there were people from David's old neighborhood, kids from his former school, working families who had saved up to buy tickets to see the boy who had made it big. The concert hall manager, a stern woman who usually only worried about ticket sales and VIP guests, peeked through the curtain at the crowd. She had been skeptical about featuring such a young, unknown pianist, but when she saw the mix of people in the audience, rich and poor, young and old, all united by curiosity about this remarkable young man, she smiled. Backstage, David stood quietly with his eyes closed. He wasn't reviewing his pieces or worrying about technical difficulties. Instead, he was listening to the music inside his heart. The same music that had saved him that night 5 years ago. A stagehand approached him. 5 minutes, David. David nodded and opened his eyes. He walked to the edge of the stage curtain and peeked out at the audience. So many faces. So many people who had come to hear him play. His eyes found his parents in the front row. His mother gave him a small wave and mouthed, "We love you." His father, who rarely showed emotion, had tears in his eyes. Then David saw something that made his heart skip. In the back of the concert hall, partially hidden in the shadows, stood a group of people in work uniforms. Janitors and kitchen staff from various buildings around the city. People who understood what it meant to work hard for very little recognition. They had come on their night off to see one of their own achieve something extraordinary. David's success was their success too. It proved that dreams weren't just for rich people. It showed that talent could bloom anywhere if given the chance. The stage manager signaled that it was time. David took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The applause was thunderous. People stood and cheered before he had even played a single note. But David barely heard them. All his attention was focused on the beautiful concert grand piano waiting for him in the spotlight. He sat down at the bench and adjusted his position. The keys felt familiar under his fingers, like old friends welcoming him home. He looked out at the audience one more time, then closed his eyes and began to play. The first piece was a classical sonata by Mozart. Technical, precise, beautiful. David played it flawlessly, showing all the proper training he had received. The audience listened appreciatively, impressed by his skill. But then something magical happened. Just like that night 5 years ago. David began to move beyond the written notes. He started to add his own interpretations, his own emotions, his own story to the music. The Mozart became more than just a perfectly executed classical piece. It became David's conversation with the composer across centuries. It became his thank you letter to everyone who had believed in him. It became his promise to use his gift to touch other hearts the way music had touched his. When the Mozart ended, the applause was enthusiastic but polite. Classical music appreciation from a sophisticated audience. But David wasn't finished. For his second piece, he had chosen something different, something that would remind everyone of the night that changed his life. He began to play the same improvised melody he had created 5 years ago at the fundraiser, but now it was fuller, richer, more complex. 5 years of training had given him new tools to express the same emotions. The melody told the story of a boy who had been invisible until music made him seen. It spoke of struggle and hope, of dreams deferred but not destroyed. It painted pictures of late nights spent practicing in empty rooms and early mornings filled with possibility. As David played, something extraordinary happened in the audience. The wealthy donors found themselves sitting next to working-class families, all moved by the same beautiful sounds. The barriers between rich and poor, educated and self-taught, seemed to dissolve in the presence of music that came straight from the heart. Mrs. Wellington found herself crying for the second time because of David's playing. But these weren't tears of surprise like 5 years ago. These were tears of gratitude. Gratitude that she had been present at the birth of something wonderful. Gratitude that she had been able to help nurture it. Antonio listened with the pride of a teacher whose student had surpassed him. But more than that, he felt the joy of someone who had been forgiven for his cruelty and given the chance to make amends. David's parents held each other and wept openly. Their son, who had once mopped floors in fancy buildings, was now commanding the attention of hundreds of people with his gift. But perhaps the most moved were the janitors and kitchen workers standing in the back. They saw themselves in David's story. They understood that his success meant their children might have chances they never had. His music told them that their work had dignity, their dreams had value, and their children had unlimited potential. As David played the final notes of his improvisation, the entire concert hall rose to its feet. The applause went on for nearly 10 minutes. People cheered and cried and celebrated not just David's talent, but the reminder that beauty could emerge from the most unlikely places. When the applause finally died down, David stood and took his bow. But before leaving the stage, he looked out at the audience and spoke the only words he would say that evening. "Thank you for believing in the music that lives inside all of us." Then he walked off the stage, leaving behind a room full of people who had been reminded that miracles still happen, dreams still come true, and sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the humblest beginnings.